Thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. We are in Miami again tonight as debate prep reaches its furious apex for the 20 Democratic presidential candidates who are converging on this city for a two-night doubleheader debate that starts tomorrow night and continues into Thursday night. This is the first debate of the Democratic presidential primary. As you might imagine, the decision of the Democratic National Committee to cite this key first debate here in Miami, it is a strategic decision for the party. Not only is this state of Florida, of course, a key swing state with a huge population and a huge number of electoral votes that seems like every year end up being of crucial importance when it comes to picking the next president of the United States. Florida, of course, a state won twice by Barack Obama and then narrowly won by Donald Trump in 2016. But Florida and South Florida in particular, and Miami in particular, are home to a massively diverse field of voters. And that is also, I think, a key part of the calculation here. Miami, of course, has a large African-American population. African-American voters have long been basically the key that unlocks general election possibilities for Democratic contenders in general elections. But Miami is also a majority Latino city. 70% of the population in Miami is Hispanic. And that Spanish-speaking and Latino population in Miami is itself really diverse. And so the Democratic Party choosing to cite their first debate for the 2020 campaign here in Miami, it's basically a de facto challenge to all these candidates to make sure they are competing for all different kinds of Latino votes and to prioritize that at the start of the Democratic primary and at the start of their campaigns. And so that is why I think the coincidence of this first debate here in Miami and the latest news of this administration's attitude toward and treatment of Latino immigrants and their families, and particularly little kids, I think that is part of why this is a particularly potent mix right now. Because the Democratic candidates competing for the opportunity to run against Trump to try to end his administration, they would be criticizing him for what he has done to immigrants anyway. But to have that happening in the light of these latest revelations, that criticism, that competition for what the country should be like, should it continue as it is under Trump, or should it continue under different leadership who would handle this matter specifically quite differently? I mean, that resonates across the country right now with an electorate that is getting increasingly stunned by what they are learning about the Trump administration's behavior in the news this week, and specifically now today. As we've been reporting here on the show over the last few days, we've gotten these just absolutely horrifying accounts from U.S. Border Patrol stations near the Mexican border about two things. The way that kids coming over the border are still being separated from their parents and their adult family members, even though the Trump administration claims they ended the policy of separating families a year ago. That is still happening. They are still taking little kids systematically away from their parents at the border. So that's one. Also, we are learning about the conditions in which those kids are being held by the Trump administration after they are forcibly separated from their families. The gut-wrenching descriptions we have of conditions at some Border Patrol facilities have been coming in the most part, from lawyers who are able to access these facilities because they are monitoring compliance with government rules about how kids are supposed to be treated in Border Patrol custody. These lawyers have done these monitoring trips for years. As a rule, they do not talk to the press about their visits. They're used in ongoing litigation and legal matters. But despite the fact that a lot of these lawyers have been doing this for years, if not decades, these experienced lawyers who have kind of seen it all, this past week, they have been so shocked and so disgusted by what they found that they decided that they needed, for the first time, to go public and to sound the alarm, to let the country know what they were seeing. One of these lawyers told the Associated Press, quote, "In my 22 years of doing visits with children in detention, I have never heard of this level of inhumanity." As we reported last night, the most recent egregious reports have come from a Border Patrol station in Clint, Texas. where the lawyers who visited reported kids as young as infants sleeping on concrete floors, not being allowed to bathe or brush their teeth, not having access to soap or toothbrushes or diapers, older kids being made to take care of the toddlers and babies on their own, kids being fed terrible food and the same food day after day after day, kids getting sick, kids coping on their own with spreading lice infestations. The lawyers found that facility in Clint by chance. It was not even supposed to be housing children, but they heard a rumor that kids were being detained there. One lawyer said that one of the kids detained there told her that hundreds more kids had been there, but he didn't know where they had gone. So the lawyers decided to look around. They drove around the facility until they found out back a brand new windowless warehouse that hadn't been there before. It's recently erected. They were later told that, in fact, a couple hundred more kids were being held in that windowless steel warehouse. And these descriptions of these conditions have shocked and horrified the country for the last several days, along with the dawning revelation that these kids do not need to be there at all. Quote, officials at the border seem to be making no effort to release children to caregivers. Many have parents in the United States. Rather, they're holding them for weeks in overcrowded cells at the border, incommunicado from their desperate loved ones. Quote, a second grader we interviewed entered the room silently, but burst into tears when we asked who she traveled with to the U.S. My aunt, she said with a keening cry. A bracelet on her wrist had the words U.S. parent and a phone number written in permanent marker. We called the number on the spot and found out that no one had informed her desperate parents of where she was being held. Quote, some of the most emotional moments of our visit came witnessing children speak for the first time with their parents on an attorney's phone. The New York Times reported that lawyers met with 60 kids in the Clint Border Patrol station who, quote, ranged from 17 years old to 5 months old. Again, kids taken away from their families. 5 months old? The infants were either children of minor parents who are also detained, or they had been separated from adult family members with whom they had crossed the border. The separated children were now alone, being cared for by other young detainees. One lawyer telling the New Yorker magazine, quote, there were children at this facility who came across with parents and were separated from parents. There were other children at the facility who came across with adult family members. We met almost no children who came across unaccompanied. Quote, the United States is taking children away from their family unit and reclassifying them as unaccompanied children, but they were not unaccompanied children. And the national uproar over these kids still now being taken away from their families and being held indefinitely in these totally inappropriate, appalling conditions. Amid that national uproar, yesterday we found out that nearly 300 kids had been moved out of that one Border Patrol facility in Clint, Texas. We talked to Texas Congresswoman Veronica Escobar about that last night. That facility in Clint is just outside her district in El Paso. She said that as of last night, she was not sure exactly where those 300 kids had been moved out to. She just knew they had been moved out of the facility in Clint. That was how we left it last night. Then today, just a remarkable series of events. First, the head of the U.S. Border Patrol quits. That facility in Clint, Texas is a Border Patrol facility, as is the one in McAllen, Texas, where similar conditions have been described for yet more hundreds of kids. Amid this outcry over what his agency is doing to these kids right now, the head of the Border Patrol quit today. He resigned. He was actually the acting head of the Border Patrol. He'd only been there for a couple of months. He'd never been confirmed in the position, but that is not uncommon, thanks to a string of firings and reassignments that kicked off after President Trump told Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen that she should illegally block all asylum applications to the United States. Given all of the resignations and firings and reassignments that have happened since then, we are now in a position where every single border-related or immigration-related agency in the entire U.S. government has only an acting leader who has not been vetted or confirmed by the Senate. But the latest head of the Border Patrol, he quit today after less than 2 months on the job. Then we got word that the Border Patrol has now decided to move kids back into that facility in Clint, Texas. I mean, yesterday, after all these reports about the horrible conditions and the national outcry over that, they moved 300 kids out of there. Today, they reversed course and said they're going to move maybe 100 kids back in. Why is that? A Border Patrol official who insisted on remaining anonymous held a call with reporters to confirm this news, to confirm that Border Patrol is in fact moving kids back into this facility that has given rise to these horrifying reports and this national outrage over the past few days. I can tell you actually here how that goes exactly because we got a transcript of the call today. A reporter asks, quote, "Are you not concerned that you've now moved 100 children back to the very same facility where these allegations have surfaced from? What the reaction would be from the public and Congress, who you're asking for money from?" Anonymous Border Patrol official, quote, "I'm not concerned because a full investigation will be completed, and frankly, I personally don't believe these allegations." So it's not a problem to put kids back in that facility, even though just yesterday we spirited 300 of them out of there. It's not a problem because everything you've heard about what's going on in there is a lie. I'm sure those kids are doing just fine. Who cares what anybody says? I don't believe any of it. And now, at the end of this astonishing day, now we learn who is likely to be installed to replace the Border Patrol chief who has just quit amid this disaster. And it looks like the leading contender is this guy.
I've been in the detention facilities where I've walked up to these individuals that are so-called minors, 17 or under, and I've looked at them and I've looked at their eyes, Tucker, and I said, that is a soon-to-be MS-13 gang member. They are renting kids. They're paying to rent somebody's kid and then fake themselves as a family.
That is the Trump administration's acting head of ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. That is who, reportedly, President Trump is going to choose to take over the Border Patrol today, since the other guy quit in the midst of this national uproar over this humanitarian disaster of what the Trump administration has been doing to these little kids. And in the midst of that uproar, apparently what the president wants is someone at the top of Border Patrol who will tell him the so-called families he's separating are fake families. Those little kids, they're just stunt kids. He wants somebody who'll go down to those Border Patrol facilities and look those little kids in the eye and see that they're all actually future gang members. That is who will now be running this show with your tax dollars on behalf of the United States of America. And the president and the vice president and Republican members of Congress and the anonymous Border Patrol official who spoke to reporters today, they all say that what Border Patrol really needs is more money. And specifically that Democrats, if they really want to help these kids, who, by the way, are being treated just fine, well, they need to send more money to the Border Patrol that has been running these facilities this way. And in fact, right now, at this hour, Democrats in the House are actually passing a bill that would send billions of dollars to the border, including to the facilities caring for migrants at the border. But Democrats in Congress are also being very clear that what is happening at the border right now, what's happening, for example, at that facility in Clint, Texas, is not something that's happening because the Trump administration doesn't have money to do better.
You cannot tell me that the federal government does not have money for toothpaste and soap. This is inflicted on these children as punishment to try to bring Democrats to the table to compromise on the border wall. I think that is absolutely important. The other thing that I think is critical is that we need to stop saying that the policy for family separation has ended. It has not. Since when is a grandmother, an aunt, or a sibling not considered family? Only at the U.S. border. You can't tell me that this problem cannot be solved. You remember that President Trump just a few days ago said, well, he was going to cancel education, cancel recreation, cancel the hygiene needs. This was deliberate. How dare you torture children to try to get a compromise out of Democrats? And I am sorry, but hearing about children walking around in soiled diapers, hearing about children taking care of toddlers, you are talking about straight up child abuse. And I think that this needs to be condemned internationally, frankly.
This is a story that has sort of electrified the country a little bit. It has resulted, for example, in Americans being moved to bring boxes of diapers and toothbrushes and soap to these facilities. People have literally been showing up in the parking lot and asking for this stuff to be given to the kids who are being held there. One man who grew up in Clint, Texas, and tried to bring supplies to the facility there told the Texas Tribune today, quote, "It makes me feel powerless knowing there's children taking care of toddlers and little kids knowing what's happening in your community and that you can't give these kids supplies to clean or clothe themselves, it's heartbreaking. For God's sake, they're kids, man. Border Patrol has been turning all of those donations away and saying that they will not accept them. When reporters asked that "I won't give you my name" anonymous Border Patrol official who was asked to brief the press about this today, he or she said in response, quote, "We're not running low on those things. Those things are available now, and they have been continuously. Those items are available now. We've used our own funding to buy those things. Plenty of soap, plenty of toothbrushes, plenty of food." But really, apparently, it's not about money. I mean, Trump's Border Patrol is happy to tell reporters today that they have all the money to buy all those basic supplies, hygiene items, food, clean clothes, all of it. That's all been taken care of. So then why are these kids allegedly living right now under their care in these horrific conditions with none of those things? And the other explanation from the Trump administration as to why this is happening is that they just don't have the capacity to hold these kids in conditions that are any way more decent. They just have to hold them in conditions like this because there's too many of them and there's no space, there's nowhere to move them to. What has never made sense about that from the very beginning is that there's no reason they have to be holding these kids at all, of course. I mean, remember, the lawyers visiting these facilities say plenty of these kids, they're interviewing these kids. What they find immediately is that these kids have family members in the U.S., or they cross the border with family members from whom they do not need to be separated. But apparently the Trump administration has decided that they will separate these kids anyway, and then they will make little to no effort to contact these kids' relatives. I mean, remember, the little girl who'd been separated from her aunt, who was with her aunt, right? She's got a permanent marker on a bracelet on her wrist with a U.S. parent's phone number, right? The lawyers do what you would do in the situation like that. As a human, they called the parent, who was in fact in the United States. The parent had no idea where that little girl was. Nobody had ever called. It took that happenstance interaction with a lawyer who thought to do that because the Trump administration is not bothering. They are just taking the kids away from adult family members and then they'll figure it out. Remember the lawyers who say they found almost no kids who had come across the border unaccompanied. These kids are being separated from family members. And the Trump administration keeps saying, you know, we have nothing we can do with these kids. Well, one of the things you could do is call their freaking relatives in the United States, because they have freaking relatives in the United States. If these kids were released to their family members in the United States, which used to be the policy for how these things were handled, well, then those kids could be released to their U.S. relatives, and the care and housing and feeding of these kids would come at zero cost to the United States. But instead, the Trump administration has decided they're going to keep these kids instead. And that is what this boils down to. And honestly, that's happening right now in particular, because that is what President Trump wants to run for re-election on. It's not like this is an accidental policy. It's not like this is an unintended outcome. This is his platform for the re-elect. Joining us now is Congressman Ben Ray Lujan, Democrat of New Mexico. Congressman, thank you very much for being with us. I know it's a busy night with lots of votes tonight.
Rachel, thanks for having me tonight.
Let me ask about, a lot has happened just in the past 24 hours. A lot has happened with regard to Border Patrol and the Trump administration and attempts at accountability for the way these kids are being treated on the border. Can you give us any up-to-date understanding in terms of what Congress is trying to do to stop this behavior by the administration or to hold anybody accountable for it?
Well, first, Rachel, there should be no question that the Trump administration, as has been reported, appears to be intentionally mistreating these kids, separating them and putting them in the most inhumane conditions. And what Congress is doing right now, under Democratic leadership, with Speaker Pelosi at the helm, is making sure that we're passing an initiative to direct more funding with guardrails so that we're able to get food, supplies, sanitary items, blankets, making sure that there's health care provided for these kids and for these families as well, and ensuring that there's going to be humane treatment of these children. But make no mistake, I traveled personally with other members of Congress to some of these facilities these kids were in cages, sleeping on floors, foil blankets, overcrowded cells where they were sharing one open latrine, one open toilet, where families would make coverings however they could with their bodies shielding so people could at least use the restroom with no dignity. It's an absolute shame, and shame on the Trump administration for doing this.
We've learned that as the Democratic candidates are convening in Miami, a number of them have been making an issue while they're taking this trip here, making an issue of the conditions in one facility that's not far from Miami. It's in Homestead, Florida. Beto O'Rourke, Jay Inslee have gone or are going. Elizabeth Warren tonight said that she is going to the Homestead Migrant Detention Facility tomorrow, ahead of tomorrow night's debate in which she will appearing. She told a crowd in Miami tonight they should come with her on that trip. Do you think it makes a difference for you to do these congressional visits like the one that you just described, for these presidential candidates to show up, to bring people with them? I feel like the more this stuff gets exposed, the more dug in the Trump administration gets on the idea that they actually think this is the way that this ought to be done.
Rachel, I would say it's absolutely imperative that more members of Congress visit these facilities. As a matter of fact, the legislation that we're voting on in just a few minutes has language that allows members of Congress to do spot visits at these facilities without having to be prior approved. Look at just Clint, Texas. A member of Congress tried showing up to that facility where they took 300 kids out and they wouldn't let her in. And then when she went back the next day, there were no children. And now we're finding out that those children are being sent back there. So it's absolutely imperative that members of Congress continue to show up. And that's why we need to pass this language that cannot prevent members of Congress from being able to go into those facilities to inspect them themselves.
Congressman Ben Ray Lujan, thank you so much for joining us tonight from Washington. I much appreciate your time, sir. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
As I mentioned, and as the congressman mentioned, there are votes happening right now in the House that includes Democrats essentially trying to constrain the Trump administration in terms of the way they are able to treat kids in Border Patrol custody and in other migrant custody. House Democrats are going to put those conditions in the funding bill that they are passing tonight. Obviously, the Republican-controlled Senate will not agree, but a fight will then be on as to whether or not the money for those agencies will come with those kind of strings. That's part of what's going on in Washington tonight. Another thing that is going on in Washington tonight is something that has broken actually since we have started the show just in the past few minutes. It is about Robert Mueller, and late-breaking news right now that he is being subpoenaed to testify before Congress. This is something that we thought might be coming. We thought it might be coming from before Mueller turned in his report. We have thought that might be where it ended up once we saw his redacted report and the way it's been handled by the Justice Department. Once we saw comments from Mueller himself about whether or not he intended to speak to Congress, we are getting word tonight that Mueller is being subpoenaed. We have just arranged for Congressman Adam Schiff, the chairman of the Intelligence Committee, to join us live next to tell us what exactly is happening with that big development. But that story is just breaking, and Congressman Schiff will be here with us when we come back after this break. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.